Welcome, everyone, to our first in-depth study of the book of James. We're going to cover today's lesson in 6 sections, as indicated here. James himself has kindly agreed to comment on some of the sections. I know you'll enjoy his commentary as much as I have. We'll start with verses 2 through 4.
Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything.
James 1, 2 through 4 teaches believers to view trials as opportunities for spiritual growth, as these challenges test faith, produce perseverance, and lead to maturity and completeness in Christian character. This teaching connects to the broader biblical theme of God using suffering to discipline and refine His people, Hebrews 12, 5 through 11. But our passage in James is even more difficult for us to accept. James exhorts believers to consider it pure joy when facing trials. The term used here refers to external hardships rather than internal temptation. These trials encompass poverty, persecution, loss, and other hardships of living in a broken world, 1 Peter 1:6, Romans 5:3 through 4. James assures readers that trials are under God's providential control. Like the Israelites in their wilderness trials or Job in his suffering, believers are called to trust God's sovereign purposes even when circumstances seem unjust. I don't know anything about Lydia and Everly Livingston other than what has been reported by the press regarding these sisters who were figure skaters and were tragically lost in the recent crash at Washington Reagan Airport. I don't know whether this question will occur to the family, but how can they regard this as an opportunity? Or even worse, something about which they should feel joy? To be honest, I am quite repulsed by this suggestion. Trials serve a divine purpose, testing faith to refine and purify it, akin to the process of refining gold or silver. This testing strengthens and purifies faith rather than merely evaluating its presence. This perspective aligns with Old Testament reflections on suffering as a path to righteousness, for example, Job's endurance. But frankly, in my humanness, I am still repulsed by this. Nonetheless, we are told that trials develop perseverance, a steadfast endurance that equips believers to remain faithful under hardship. The imagery reflects carrying a heavy load over time, strengthening spiritual muscles through sustained effort. Perseverance is a necessary step toward spiritual maturity. Luke 8:15. Revelations 2:2, the latter of which says, I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked men, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and have not grown weary. The ultimate goal of trials is teleos, which is translated as mature or perfect, character, which signifies moral integrity and spiritual wholeness. This maturity reflects God's holiness, underscoring a complete alignment with His character, Matthew 5:48. James envisions believers as complete, lacking nothing in their virtues. Testing and perseverance work together to produce this wholeness, aligning believers with God's sanctifying purposes. Acts 3:16 and 1 Thessalonians 5:23.
Bill, thanks for having me back, and I know it wasn't in our script, but I cannot help emphasizing here that it takes sincere, deeply felt faith to undergo this kind of testing with perseverance. But when we speak of faith, are we talking about the kind of faith that saves, that is, justifies us, meaning the faith we need to accept that Christ's death of the cross is sufficient to pay for our sins? No, that is not really the faith being described here. What James is talking about here is faith in our God, who will bring about sanctification in our lives in spite of and even because of our trials. I think this is the harder faith. After all, who can possibly see anything good coming out of the tragic loss of a couple of ice skating sisters in the plane crash that you have cited, Bill? What you call verses 2 through 4 of the first chapter of my letter encourages believers to see trials as God's instrument for spiritual growth, emphasizing that perseverance through hardship refines faith and leads to a mature, complete character. By situating suffering within God's providential plan, I suggest hope and purpose, urging Christians to trust in God's transformative work and to embrace trials as pathways to holiness and ultimate joy, as impossible as this sometimes appears.
Okay, let's move to the next set of verses, 5 through 8 of chapter 1.
But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that person ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways.
Is James changing the subject here, or is James saying that wisdom is essential to endure trials with the right perspective and achieve the spiritual maturity that he describes in verses 2 through 4? We'll discuss this question when we meet. Using Jewish wisdom language, James frames wisdom as the means by which believers discern and fulfill God's will, tying it to integrity and spiritual wholeness. James highlights God's character as one who gives wisdom generously and without finding fault. Believers can approach God confidently, knowing he will not reproach them for their lack of wisdom. Believers must ask in faith without doubting. Doubt, in this context, refers to a fundamental wavering or divided loyalty, not occasional uncertainty. James uses imagery of a wave, shifting with the wind, to describe the instability of a doubter. Such a person is double-minded, dipsychos, characterized by inconsistency in faith and action. James echoes his brother Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount, "Ask, and it will be given to you," Matthew 7:7, and other teachings about prayer and faith, emphasizing the need for trust in God's provision.
My thought, as inspired by God's Spirit, was and is that believers should seek wisdom in undivided faith, trusting in God's character and generosity. I use the wave analogy to contrast the stability of faith-filled prayer with the instability of doubt, emphasizing that spiritual maturity requires wholehearted dependence on God. It was my hope that this teaching would set the stage for my broader call to integrity and consistency throughout my letter. Next, I'll discuss what can get in the way of this wholehearted reliance on God. People in low socioeconomic strata can be so focused on their physical needs that they don't think enough about how they are God's children. And the wealthy think too much about where they'll spend their next vacation.
Thanks, James, for the lead-in to the next section, where you comfort and admonish both the poor and rich among us.
Now the brother or sister of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position, but the rich person is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, and its flower falls off, and the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So also the rich person, in the midst of his pursuits, will die out.
Rich individuals are urged to take pride in their low position, which may signify humility derived from their identification with Christ and acknowledgement of the transitory nature of wealth. Alternatively, if the rich person is interpreted as a non-Christian, the exhortation could be seen as ironic, highlighting their impending judgment. Does it matter which interpretation is right? James refers to the brother in humble circumstances as someone of low socioeconomic status, likely reflecting the struggles of many early Christians facing poverty and social displacement. Despite what might seem to them as worldly insignificance, the poor are encouraged to take pride in their high position, referring to their spiritual status as heirs of God's kingdom. James underscores the fleeting nature of wealth and status, comparing the rich to a flower that withers under the scorching heat, symbolizing the inevitable demise of earthly possessions. This imagery echoes biblical traditions, for example, Isaiah 40, 6-8, which reads, "All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. The people are indeed grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever." No matter what we might think of Elon Musk, he and his billions of dollars of wealth will someday be separated, and no amount of age delay investments or travel to Mars will change that.
I wanted this passage to, first of all, show that an abundance of wealth or the absence of it can prevent us from focusing on what God is trying to do in our lives. And secondly, what I wrote here reflects Jesus' teaching that one cannot serve both God and money, as Matthew records in Matthew 6:24.
Thanks for that summary again, James. We now move to verse 12, which pronounces a blessing on Christians who endure trials.
Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him.
A lot of people have asked about this verse. Isn't it just saying the same as the teaching in the earlier verses about trials building Christian character? Well, yes, but while I want readers to understand that there is a reward for adopting the mindset I advocate in the early verses, that regardless of circumstances we are to have faith of the sanctifying type in God, I wanted to communicate that without fostering a selfish or transactional mindset. In other words, I want readers to think, I'm going to trust God because of who He is, not because I believe He'll give me a great reward for doing so. I use the word blessed, which reflects God's favor, not necessarily emotional happiness, emphasizing a deeper spiritual state rather than a transient feeling. By using the symbol of a crown, like the laurel wreath given to victors in ancient athletic competitions, I wanted to convey the idea of running a race, requiring discipline and steadfast commitment. So we come to what you would call a chicken and egg problem. As Christians, do we, by facing trials, develop perseverance, verse 2, or do we persevere when faced with trials, verse 12? Or, to use the metaphor I used here, which comes first, training each day leading to a better ability to persevere during the race, or persevering each day through the training to become a better racer? Which is it? If you are asking that question, good, that's what I wanted. And the answer is simply yes.
Well, James, I guess we're going to have to think about that a bit, right? Thanks. Next, we come to verses 13 through 15 of the first chapter.
No one is to say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. but each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it has run its course, brings forth death.
How does this section and the next illuminate further our understanding of the tension between human responsibility and God's sovereignty?
I am so glad you asked this question because without saying it explicitly, this is what I was writing about. There's no doubt that reading the chapter so far as inspired wisdom literature is profitable regarding, for example, temptation, the cycle of sin, and God's goodness in the face of our failure. But underneath these points is a more subtle one, having to do with God's sovereignty and human will, as you have implied in the question you have just asked. Let me try to explain. To put it simply, I'm saying that while God does allow hardship, loss, and even tragedy into our lives, there is a big difference between God using difficulties to build Christian character and the temptation to sin. Note, though, that they may be related. For example, if during a difficult trial that God is using to build perseverance in our lives, we instead decide to dismiss the whole notion of a loving God and thereby sin, God is still only responsible for the trial, but not the sin. Some people, when they hear this, they react very strongly and say that God cannot have it both ways. He cannot send us a trial to which we react badly and claim that sending the trial wasn't the ultimate cause of our rejection. But that is exactly what he does say, and that truly is a test of our sanctifying type faith. Do we believe in a sovereign God who makes this claim? That is really quite incomprehensible and yet accept it, or do we reject God's claims and stand on our own intellect? In his sovereignty, God desires to bring his people to their full potentials as his followers. In that process, he somehow makes room for failure on the part of his people, but his people must realize their responsibility to check the tendency to sin. To reiterate, God cannot be tempted by evil nor tempts anyone to sin. Verse 13. This distinguishes trials which God permits for growth from temptation, which arises from human sinful desires. Sin must be stopped as soon as it is recognized, otherwise it can lead to death, a progression we see in the Old Testament.
More food for thought from James. I'm looking forward to our discussion about this. Now, finally, to the last section of our study, verses 16 to 18.
Don't be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created.
James transitions with the imperative, do not be deceived, urging readers to recognize God's role as the giver of all good and perfect gifts. God is described as the Father of lights, a reference to his creative power over celestial bodies, contrasted with his unchanging nature. Unlike the variability of the heavens, God's character is steadfast and reliable, making him the ultimate source of goodness.
I've made the point earlier that some people see my writing as only unconnected pieces of wisdom, much like we have in Proverbs. To some extent that is true, but again, there is a thread that connects much of the writing, and the first part of chapter 1 certainly qualifies in that way. Bill has asked me to summarize this section we're studying today to help show how that thread is woven through the ideas. Ending with my commentary on the last two verses. Consider it joy when God puts us through trials because he is working to reshape us into his will. This is the very difficult advocacy of verses 2 through 4. But we are advised in verses 5 through 8 to employ, without serious doubts, wisdom, which is awarded to those who fundamentally believe in God and what he says about his control over the universe, combined with his statements that he loves us without reservation, in that he gives generously and without reproach. Too often, as verses 9 through 11 state, much wealth or, on the other extreme, poverty become obstacles to applying that wisdom in seeing and appreciating God's working through adversity. We think we don't need God because of our wealth, or we think we will trust God more once we have enough money. The wealth and poverty issue isn't the only matter that troubles us. Another is that we don't understand what we are told about God's work in our lives and our own freedoms and responsibilities. They just seem to contradict each other. How can it be said that God tests but never tempts? Isn't there inherent in every trial a temptation to walk away from God?
Okay, James. Yeah, I can see why you suggest that your letter is not just fraying threads of wise sayings, not that there is anything wrong with that, and the tight thread of continuity that you weave is kinda mind-blowing. It's good that we'll soon have time to discuss these things. Thanks again. I'd like to conclude this session by going back to where we started today and put out there an example of someone who is apparently well on the way of sanctification, as is described in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 23. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. On January 15, 2013, a free concert titled A Night of Hope and Healing was held at the Webster Bank Arena in Bridgeport, Connecticut. This event aimed to provide spiritual support and remembrance for the Newtown, Connecticut community following the tragic Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. The concert featured performances by Christian artists such as Casting Crowns, Toby Mac, Mandisa, Building 429, Laura Story, and Stephen Curtis Chapman. Speakers included Max Lucado, Louis Giglio, and Mary Beth Chapman, the latter of whom shared her family's personal story during the event. The story she related happened in May 2008, when a tragic accident occurred at their home in Franklin, Tennessee, where their 5-year-old daughter, Maria Sue Chapman, was accidentally struck and killed by a car driven by her 17-year-old brother, Will Franklin Chapman, in the family's driveway. Mary Beth Chapman was able to tell this story 5 years after the event as a story of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. How can a mother who went through this experience stand on a stage and tell about it, and even publicly hug the son responsible for the tragedy? The answer is contained within a verse just mentioned. 1 Thessalonians 5:23. May God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. That concludes this lesson. I look forward to discussing it with you and preparing and sending the next one on the last part of Chapter 1 and the first part of Chapter 2 of James.